Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Probably Cancelled podcast in coalition with the Midwestern Marx Institute. My name is Bridget. I'm your host, and today I'm here with Alexander McKay from the Marx Engels Lenin Institute. And I'm super happy to have you here. Alex, how are you doing today?
Doing very well, thank you, comrade. It's good to be here with you and speak to an American audience, which is in a country which is finally turning a corner with regard to organization of its own communist party. So happy to be here at an interesting time for, I think, both centers of imperialism finally facing huge challenges in the world, and with both of sides of the Atlantic, we need to respond to that. And I think things are finally moving in the right direction to a certain degree with regard to that. But we a lot to discuss today with regard to that, and also I think how we got to this point and errors that have been made that date back quite a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the Western left, the state of it, its failures, how we got here, and probably what we can do to fix things up a little bit. And I've had many requests from my listeners to have you on the podcast, so it's long overdue. I'm super happy to have you here, tuning in all the way from England. And just to start off, could you tell our audience more about the work that you do?
Well, I started doing online work on YouTube. It's nearly 5 years ago now that I initially started it, and it was feels like a millennia ago, really, because I was just out of the Corbyn era experiment known as the Labour Party during that time, the Corbyn leadership, which I know quite a lot of Americans followed with some interest, and I fell out of that because, well, if I started speaking about that, I'd take an hour. But in very brief terms, it crystallized all the failures of the British left for me inside
Hmm.
one concentrated period of years. And so I dropped out of that. Then it was of course the Corbyn was destroyed by an electoral wipeout, but perversely got more votes than Keir Starmer did, winning the election this time round. So there you go. That's the British system for you. Um, but I dropped out of that. I started doing YouTube work, then I kind of dropped off it for a while, and I started a podcast called Red Star Radio, which I co-presented for a while with a Canadian comrade called Layla, all the way through the 2021, 2022. When we started off trying to do a Marxist analysis of um, the response to COVID in principally in Canada, where she was based, in Britain and the US, and that actually helped develop my thoughts quite a lot, because what I found was that so many people who called themselves Marxists had a completely uncritical attitude towards the actions of the capitalist state, uh, and they'd really fallen to pieces in regard to with regard to being able to analyze things from in terms of class. So, for instance, like the investigating COVID and its handling, we found that like many Marxists or supposed Marxists just were prepared to completely go along with the idea of science being detached from the process of production. So,
Hmm.
going all the way back to Engels' work on dialectics of nature and things that Marx wrote, they were clear that science has its place within the bourgeois system of production, like everything
Right.
else, meaning that
Right.
there is a specific purpose for which the scientific process is being, this process of innovation and all the things related to it are being turned to in order to boost the profits of capital, and that gives science and all of its spheres a certain class bias and a certain way in which it's organized, way in which the work is organized, which promotes profitability over everything else and bourgeois
Yeah.
relations of production and bourgeois ideology. Now, that to me is quite a simple Marxist concept, but so many people had forgotten it completely. They just
Hmm.
saw, they took what I would call a sort of very hysterical liberal attitude towards all of these things. They couldn't understand that um, that science is not something that is a purely like objective process divorced from the laws of production. Again, like if you
Right.
couldn't see it, wouldn't see it.
It's
And so
crazy.
that was a big moment for me in terms of developing my understanding. Is like, oh right, we really are fucked, because if you can't understand something that's there in black and white from Engels himself, and if you're starting to think that like something which is so crucial for capitalist production, which is science and innovation, be it medical science or engineering or anything else, then you can't understand anything. And then we got to just the understanding that so many people had with regard to the role of the state. Like people were getting excited about, oh, the state's enforcing public health measures. It's like, yeah, against workers. They kept like, um, they were protecting, if anybody, the ruling class. People who worked in warehouses, people who worked in um, retail, people who worked in delivery, or dealing or in the health sector itself, were all still going to work every day. Like, but these people who called themselves Marxists had completely lost the plot. It's like, oh wow, the state's enforcing health measures again. It's like, well, are you not looking at the set of class relations this is based on? And what became obvious was that so many people who call themselves Marxists in Britain and in Canada and the United States aren't Marxists at all. They're social democrats, in the sense
Hmm.
that they understand politics as being simply being state market dichotomy, meaning that they completely swallow like the arguments made by bourgeois politicians regarding, oh, well, we have the state over here and the market over here, and here's the debates about the fact that the two apparently never meet, despite the fact that that's not true and was never true. It's only true in like the propaganda of like a Ted Cruz or a Bernie Sanders. But that's the understanding you have of all these people had. It's like, well, if the state does something, it must be good. Never mind that the set of class relations the state is built on is inherently hostile to the working class. Or the but and again, like the more we dug into it, and the more I read into the Marxist tradition, the more I realized that my own knowledge prior to this had been shockingly poor. My own theoretical understanding, my own practical understanding was lacking in the extreme, and that was and I prior to that I'd held positions in trade unions and in another political party in this country that can remain nameless unless it's funny to name it, but it was a Trotskyite party, and I realized that, oh my god, I've been going around confidently speaking on platforms for years, for about 6 or 7 years, and turns out I didn't know anything. And I'm only just starting to realize that how little I actually knew about the tradition I considered myself to be a part of for years. And it
Hmm.
was all during 2021 that I made this realization, that I opened up a whole, it was what I would call a deeply humbling experience, but a necessary one. Because you realize, like, only when you realize, like, how little do you know? How little did I know? I'm like, oh my God, I was typical of this problem, which is like you read some few excerpts of Marx, in my case, filtered through Trotsky, and then you speak about it confidently enough, and suddenly you're a leading Marxist. Whereas in actual fact, you're not.
Hmm.
You're not. You're not. You're a social democrat with
Hmm.
pretentious aspirations. And what I discovered, what by the time 2022 rolled around, I'd come to the conclusion that in the United States, the entire left were basically just New Deal Democrats. That's all they were.
Yeah.
In Canada, they're all just adjuncts of Justin Trudeau's Liberals. In Britain, they all float around they're in the orbit of the Labour Party. And in the case of same in France, same in Germany, same, well, not Italy, a little bit different, but same basic problem, which is that they have never moved beyond the desire to go back to the period of reform that existed from about, well, in America, 33 to mid 60s, New Deal period. In Britain, 45 to mid 70s, welfare capitalist period. So, this is my rather long way of saying, during this sort of extended period of realizing this is a huge problem, it forced me into a long period of like reading and reflection, where I thought, well, our big problem is that the things that describe themselves as left are either hysterical, screeching ultra lefts who spend all their time online denouncing everybody, and they're in a really a sort of unspoken partnership with a much more cynical collection of people who call themselves Marxists but are in actual fact social democrats who just push people back towards the Labour Party or push people back towards the Democrats because you got to stop fascism, right? In the form of what, Donald Trump, or in our case the Tories or Nigel Farage, and just that realization was a huge leap forward for me because then I realized that, well, okay, I've spent now 2 years doing all this reading. I feel I've reached a certain level of understanding. So, with regard to the project, like my former podcast partner moved on to do other things, and I decided to keep going. But almost by accident, I ended up doing this on YouTube because I thought, well, it's got to reach a bigger audience somehow. And what I want to
Mhm.
encourage people to do is to go through the same process that I went through, which is go back to the fundamentals, reread all the stuff that you took a glimpse at when you were 18 and thought you understood it, whereas in actual fact realize how little you know, learn the humility of failure and embrace that, and then go back and examine all these things seriously this time. And once you do, you realize that we've been going wrong for 70 years. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
in reality, on both sides of the Atlantic and in Western Europe, we mistook, I say we, the collective we mistook one period of reform in exceptional circumstances for a fundamental change when it wasn't. And then when the capitalists inevitably, as they were always going to do, turned around and started to take things back again, because periods of reform always end that way, no one knew what to do. And they didn't know what to do because the, the communists in Britain and the United States and other places had essentially abandoned Marxism really by the mid 50s and had basically just attached themselves, in your case, to the left of the Democrats, in our case, to the left of the Labour Party. And they went from tactical alignments with the Social Democrats in the like 30s to making it into an absolute hard and fast rule that you had to attach yourself to the social democracy in the 50s and the 60s onwards, and never trying to develop like a real vanguard operation ever since then, and just basically saying that their runs for office were tokenistic. They stopped trying to actually develop worker militants. They just started recruiting students every year and then firing them up and going through burning them out, recruiting another bunch, and then their whole thing ends up like imploding in the 90s until what we have now is just basically a pale shadow of what existed before. Excuse me. And it starts really before most of us either watching this or watching my own programs were even born. But you realize that the arc of history is very, very long and goes beyond many human lifetimes sometimes. And to realize that our task now is to correct mistakes that were made decades ago is a bit of a big realization. But again, this is what I hope to encourage people to do, which is to examine this and to embrace the idea that we can be part of a rectification process here. And there's never been a more important time to do it because you can see the system which has this the imperialist system now is running the sand's running out of the egg timer here. It really is. And there's never been a more important time to actually rectify these mistakes. So that's my rather long-winded and slightly digressing way of answering your question. I hope I've addressed it there.
I have so much to say back to everything you just said. So I'm gonna just whittle it down to spare everybody. But I'm glad you said all of that because that was gonna be my next question. Was kind of like your personal ideological journey. I'm always curious in people's backgrounds, and um, COVID was a super enlightening time for me as well because I also saw how people were just falling for everything hook, line, and sinker. And I
Mm,
was quite vocal about the whole thing and got a lot of backlash from the I mean, it's crazy still to believe science people are the least scientific of them all.
Mm.
And I still see this when I go to liberal areas near where I live, and there are people wearing surgical masks while they're walking outside in fresh air. And it's like, I mean, even like to this day, I recently saw that. And I'm like, don't you, I mean, the data is out on these types of masks. I thought we all were aware that these cloth masks and surgical masks don't do anything. And
Mm.
I thought you believed science. But anyway, um, you're right that it all is about getting back to the fundamentals. And I find that Western communists, people who call themselves Marxists or communists, will always repeat Mao's combat liberalism. That's like a very popular phrase, but nobody's really ready to shed the layers of liberalism that we have been brought up under, because it is a process. It's like a process of shedding. And when I went through that process of shedding, it felt amazing, but
Mm.
also it was really amazing. And I mean, I'm still uncovering new layers to this day, but it takes a certain type of person to be able to admit that too. Uh, and it can be a process with a lot of cognitive dissonance that a lot of people do not want to face.
Mm.
And you can come to positions that in the eyes of your peers will throw a lot of scrutiny at you, or even like straight up excommunicate you
Mm.
in this day and age and the political climate within the left. But I commend you for going through that process and also standing strong in your convictions and speaking about it on your show. I'm going to link your YouTube channel in the show notes so everyone can go and watch it, because every single episode you put out is so incredibly informative and such a great resource to have. I'm so glad that somebody like you is taking the initiative to do this educational work, because you really hit the nail on the head every time. So let's go into my next question, I suppose. Um, how would you outline the failures of Western Marxism, and especially in comparison to the Marxism of the East, which
Mm.
us in the West typically do not get to see? We don't really have, I mean, a lot of it is in other languages. The way people are thinking, that communists are thinking in the East, like
Mm.
how would you how would you view that?
I think the root of the failure, certainly in British and I think in American terms as well, is a failure to actually reckon properly with the full implications of being imperial core countries. And I don't mean in the sense of the what's his name, Sakai, the Settler's Book. I don't mean in that sense. I mean in the sense that what it does in terms of the distortions it introduces within the domestic working class movement that Engels started to outline and that Lenin outlined further in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Like, we've never reckoned with truly like the divisions in the working class itself, starting with as Lenin pointed out, the fact that the reason why the Second International failed all the way back in 1914, violated all of its promises and its commitments to call a general strike in the event of an imperialist war, was because its leadership had become corroded by obtaining a relatively privileged position within the imperial core countries. That in terms of the parliamentary fractions who were quite cushioned from reality, and also the leading elements in the trade unions and amongst the skilled workers who had gained more from imperialism than the unskilled workers. So there was a division there in the working class all the way back in 1914, which Lenin pointed out, and which caused the Second International to collapse, and which caused a section of the working class to be led into the war in Britain and in France and in Germany. And I think there was an attempt to deal with that in the early days of the communist movement in Europe. And there was some success made there in terms of the need to unify the working class and to have a consistently anti imperialist position, and to explain properly that when a nation dominates another one, the working class at home cannot be truly free either. And also the understanding of imperialism as a system in terms of um, it is ultimately spelling death for the domestic working class anyway, regardless of temporary gains, because of its there's the inevitable decline of profitability and inevitable move towards deindustrialization and asset stripping of both the domestic economy, the exporting of production, the the de-skilling and demoralization and atomization of the working class domestically, which is all outlined by Lenin as early as 1916. But apparently, people stopped reading this. And then, as we were covering in the previous section of the program, the the big failure comes in the mistakes made after World War II in Europe, where the biggest communist parties who had played this heroic role in the resistance against the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and France, who had they were massive organizations with millions of workers following them. By the end of the 40s, these had already taken a social democratic turn, as had the British version, which was smaller. I know in the American case there was much more state repression of the CPUSA, and they were repressed and driven out of the unions, and the American ruling class made a very serious and sustained attempt to literally break Marxism away from the working class through a combination of repression and reform in the USA. There was less of that here, but there was the social democratic collapse again in the communist parties in France and Italy, so that by the 50s, the French Communist Party is tacitly supporting the war against Algeria on the grounds that they wanted to get a coalition again with the French Social Democrats, who were pro-imperialist. The Italian communists started supporting coalitions with like Christian Democrats and Social Democrats that never really came to fruition because the U.S. imperialism called the shots in Italy and was opposed to that, but they wanted to do it anyway and were prepared to make all kinds of concessions. The upshot of all of this is that even when revolutionary events potentially emerged, such as in France in 68 or Italy from 68 to the mid 1970s, the communist parties, or even in Britain from about 67 to arguably about 85, when the working class comes under attack, when the reforms start to be clawed back again, the communist parties who should have been in a position to lead a revolutionary struggle as the class struggle changed its tempo again and moved into a much more aggressive class war being waged by the ruling class, they were so committed to reformism by that stage that they were unable and unwilling to move into a revolutionary situation or to make the most of a revolutionary situation, leading to a series of problems whereby positively anti-Marxist trends got embraced by those workers and students who had become frustrated with the old communist parties. This is part of the reason why Herbert Marcuse catches on. It's part of the reason why, like, what I would call bastardizations of Maoism catch on, that sounded really revolutionary and denounced the Soviet Union as bureaucratic or social imperialist, or the latter very incorrectly. But you get all of these things which sound ultra left, but in a dialectical way only leads to an ultra right and opportunist position. So that catches on precisely because of the real failures of the Communist Party's post 60s. And of course, with that comes a load of what I will just technically, I think is technically referred to as crap, that is now constitutes the bulk of what the left is concerned with. So the turn towards the uncritical embrace of what is referred to as the sexual revolution, which contains certain elements which are positive and a lot of elements which are not, because again, you do something like that, that's something that process is carried out under a decaying form of capitalism, imperialism, then it's going to produce, along with a certain element of positive change, an awful lot of negativity because you're already in a decaying system and a rotting culture. And so when you get that degree of, shall we say, reform coming out, or the certain elements of relaxation of in this case, cultural and moral norms, capitalism moves in and exploits that. And the problem is that because that again, like the communists had stopped actually presenting Marxism, Leninism as a worldview, and this is something I discussed with mutual comrade Carlos when he brought a book out on this very thing. And it's important to realize how much of a devastating impact, like the Communist Party's failing to present Marxism, Leninism as a worldview had on things, because suddenly they the proletariat was left without guidance when all of these different sort of social explosions took place. And if you have Marxism, Leninism as a worldview, and you're able to analyze the total set of relations, you can understand why capitalism embraces certain aspects of what's called the sexual revolution, because you can use it to sell things, because you can use it to manipulate people, because you can use it to mislead the working class into dead ends. You can use it to justify
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of hideous stuff, which I've only just started to research myself. And then you get the left instinctively then defending it, because the left from the late 60s has again just adopted a sort of Marxist tinged libertinism and
Mm-hmm.
as its guiding principle, because like the idea of the left in British and American terms just became basically like a a sad sort of a bad photocopy of 1960s radicalism over and over and over again. Until you get to the point in the 90s when what's the left and about in America and Britain? It's about what free the weed. That was the big thing
Oh
when I was a
no.
teenager. Um, um, Basically, hedonism of various different varieties, and defending whatever it is that the latest trend on in academia is, i.e., whatever Verso books are publishing about this week.
Oh
And that's basically, and you do find people who, in the left, who are older, who don't agree with that. But because they're
no.
all in
Right.
opportunist organizations who are dependent upon getting a new tranche of students in every year and never developing them, never training them, never actually educating them, but just pandering to them, they end up with all their organizations held hostage by basically screaming incoherent idiots. Because again, it's their own fault. They never trained them. They recruited opportunistically. They never engaged critically with any of these people's pre existing beliefs and just allowed them to take over all their organizations. So no
Mm-hmm.
wonder it's a mess. But again, to go
Yeah.
back and re-emphasize the point about how we got here because the Communist parties abdicated responsibility after the end of World War II. And again, this was even being criticized by people like Andrei Zhdanov by the late 40s. He was already commenting upon the fact that the Italian and the French parties had basically been compromising and capitulating. And that was formalized in the British case in 1951. It's what I was saying about it, the errors go back years because they became essentially social democratic and more bureaucratic and ossified organizations. Like what they should have been doing, which is training cadres to be ready for the moment when the reform process did end. They just pretended that if they just kept pushing the social democrats to the left, then the reform process could continue. You know, vote Labour, you know, vote for the French socialists to get a coalition with the French communists, you know, or in the case of '68, the French communists, even though there was a massive workers' rebellion, basically backed up De Gaulle and didn't um, didn't move into the revolutionary situation that emerged there. And you do all that, you end up with a generation of disillusioned and angry people who are looking for answers and find them in all kinds of stupid places, like what used to be referred to as individual terrorism, yeah, Baader Meinhof, urban guerrilla concept, stuff like that, so-called liberatory trends that involved going into the middle of America and opening up a commune. Um, Anarchism of various different varieties. All the stuff that floats around now, it all comes from these errors in that period. The abandonment of Marxism Leninism, the abandonment of serious education processes, and also the then, consequently, when the class struggle in Britain and elsewhere was severely damaged by the defeats inflicted in the 80s, then the abandonment of the working class itself. and the perpetual seeking of easy answers, be it in our case like Scottish or Welsh nationalism, or uh, pursuing an easy answer in the form of like opportunistic anti-war work, which doesn't mention imperialism, or environmentalism, but with zero class content and just embracing bourgeois environmentalism. And again, the root is all there over 50 years ago, but the full consequences are only, I think, really visible to us now.
Yeah, here in the United States, the default of the left is, I mean, if you're not a straight up Democrat, people also like to distinguish between leftists and Democrats, and at this point, I don't even bother because they both believe the same thing. Essentially, it's just
Hmm.
it's repackaged differently. But the leftist, like the radical left form, by default here in the United States is anarchism, and you still get a lot of shit for being a communist here,
Hmm.
and we're definitely the minority here among the left, because most leftists think that communists are fascists. So I mean, when I lived in Portland, if you were to call yourself a communist in Portland, when I lived there, Portland, Oregon, you would probably be banned from certain bars and establishments just for being a communist. Like that's really how it is, and it makes sense, especially in the United States, where one of the other mainstream uh, ideological trends is libertarianism.
Hmm.
We're all raised very individualistically, and during the McCarthy era and the state repression, the government really upped the ante on the left libertarianism
Hmm.
among the left to crush the communists organizing here and turn everybody into anarchistic, free loving, drugged out, burnout hippies.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's interesting you bring up the free love stuff because one thing that really bothers me is the people who cite Alexandra Kollontai as a polyamorous, like, free love liberal person. But I mean, if you read her, she literally says that relations between men and women cannot be essentially polyamorous. She doesn't use that word, but she's like, we cannot divert from monogamy under capitalism because it's just gonna fuck shit up way more.
Hmm.
But of course, nobody's reading that. They just repeat it blindly, I guess.
Well, they read like the title, "Red Love," and then decide that well, that we'll try and reenact that in my commune or squat, you know, or they read a line or a pass or a paragraph from Engels' "Origin of the Family: Private Property in the State," where he talks about the end of the bourgeois family, or the similar passages from the Communist Manifesto, never contextualizing it, never reading the
Mm-hmm.
whole explanation, for which is in brief um, that the family takes various different forms dependent upon the mode of production. And when the mode of production changes, new forms of the family will emerge as socialism grows into communism. As the hunter gatherer extended clan family moved into different things when we moved beyond the hunter gatherer stage and into the settled stage. These things are
Right.
relatively easy to explain if you take the trouble to actually read it. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't, and you end up with stupid, to use the Britishism, assholes, declaring that communism means the end, the liquefying of all social bonds, basically, which it
Oh
never does.
no.
And but and of course those people are promoted and given book deals because that's what the ruling class wants the average worker to think communism stands for, which is
Mm-hmm.
some weirdo who probably has a very questionable history, basically trying to set himself up as some sort of strange cult leader, calling himself a Marxist. And that's what's that's what's promoted by the ruling class for very good reasons. And just to go back to the '60s hippiedom stuff, like the more you read into that, without wanting to come across as like too conspiratorial at this stage, the more you see that at each stage, the American and British states were involved in this and were promoting it. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the cliche of the '60s is, oh, it's the squares versus the free loving people, whereas in actual fact, the the various different intelligence services were engaged in pushing acid in the United States for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy Leary was an intelligence asset. Various others big time hippie names were either from very bourgeois families or had some kind of shady connection with American intelligence. And the idea that the revolution was going to come from a bunch of middle class guys sitting in San Francisco off their chumps, while Charles Manson roves around in the background, being programmed by a CIA doctor or something. Um, that is hilarious to think that that was ever taken seriously, but it was.
Well, Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead goes to Bohemian Grove and sits and chats with the director of the CIA there. Like, I mean, it's crazy how people don't know this. And a lot of people here in the US, at least, will spend their entire lives following that band around from venue to venue, show to show for years, just taking acid. And I completely believe, sorry, this is tangent. I completely believe that uh, these shows, these Grateful Dead shows where like everyone is on hallucinogens was and is some sort of acid test, like government experiment on what happens when you give these drugs to a mass of people all at the same time. I'm pretty convinced of that.
I think you're right. I mean, I've only come to that conclusion recently. When you dig more into it, there's so much government involvement at each stage of the development of various different street drugs, like not just
Yeah.
acid, and all the experiments that they were doing. Certainly in the United States, we know less about the British end. I would bet that there a similar kind of thing was going on because the
Mm-hmm.
British state and American states work alongside each other. Um, Same with, I mean, it's very well established the CIA's involvement with the cocaine trade and the crack wave that hits America in the 80s.
Fentanyl.
Um,
Yeah.
what role was opium production in Afghanistan playing seems pretty obvious now. With the way in which the Taliban of all people cut it down, and when it goes through the roof under American and British control, and then it falls down again. And like the American and British ruling classes have been involved in the drug trade in the British case for a hell of a long time. So what are we
Oh yeah.
saying that suddenly in the 60s that they became hostile to it? What, because Nixon said some bad things and wanted a war on drugs? No.
Oh, that's the other thing is the commonly held position of leftists and anti-establishment people here is that they really think that the government like doesn't want us to do these hallucinogens. They don't want us, like they don't legalize it because they don't want us to know the truth. And that, I mean, once you know the true history, you're like, I think we definitely do want you to turn on, tune in, and drop out, like more than you realize.
Oh yeah, and like I think it's a strange thing that people can't see beyond the surface. People who consider themselves to be Marxists can't see beyond the surface. So, like, okay, well, laws are always written by the bourgeois in their interests. So, why wouldn't the law with regard to drugs and the drug war be written in the same way? Which is, if you're somebody who wants to get off their face and on a regular basis, the state is perfectly happy for you to do that. And they're also perfectly happy for people to deal in drugs. And periodically, the state will lock people up who deal in drugs or who take it if it's a political priority for them to go after certain people. War on drugs in Britain and the United States was much more about going after certain political groups than it was about actually preventing drug consumption. If you just sat on your
And saving
couch,
face.
yeah, if you're just sat on your couch high as hell, not engaging in any political activity, then that's fine, you know. But the depth of involvement of the various governments in the drug trade is so obvious by now, but people are still insisting that they don't want you to take it. It's like, well, why in that case why are they so heavily involved in it? And that and the fact that you're insisting that the politicians who might believe in the things that they say about anti-drug stuff are the ones that are making the decisions. They're not. Politicians are here
Right.
today, gone tomorrow, and get a reward if they're good from the ruling class. The state's permanent, and that's why I don't refer to it as the deep state. It's just the state, and its operations are massive and they cover a huge variety of uh, both criminal and legal endeavors in terms of their operations to maintain the rule of the ruling class, who are smaller now in number than they ever have been, And so they need to use more tricks than ever to keep people divided and demoralized and confused. To me, it's just once you know that, then the true role of like drugs and narcotics and everything associated with it becomes much more clear. And the fact that so many people in the United States and Britain um, who've been involved heavily in like various forms of drug dealing have also been open assets of the various different intelligence services over the years. Like the two run alongside each other. We're going, and in our case, to repeat the point, it goes all the way back to the Opium Wars. Like
Mhm.
again, do we really think that the British state has suddenly changed its policy on these things? No, they've found the drug trade useful to themselves for nearly 2 centuries. Same with other aspects of what they refer to as criminality. Same with the arms trade, obviously, very big in that. Same with
Yeah.
the sex trade. They've always
Yeah.
used that. There's a reason why British and American protectorates are some of the worst places for drug running, weapons smuggling, and people smuggling, and everything else that goes with it. Worst places in the world for like the sex trade are apparently like Kosovo, in terms of Europe, Israel. Like one of even the Israeli press admits how bad a place that is, and yet it's not a coincidence
Ukraine.
that Ukraine, the horror stories that come out of there, it's not a coincidence that these are all imperial protectorates. So do we take seriously the claims of the politicians that they're against all these things? No, not for a moment. We shouldn't anyway.
And then the leftists are like, just legalize it all.
Yeah, legalize it. Bob Marley said it, I think, in a song, so it must be good.
What can go wrong? I mean, I used to work in the weed industry, what seems like a lifetime ago, but I worked in the first ever medical marijuana farmers market in Washington State in 2011. And at that time, when I was working at this farmers market, the local elections had come up, and Washington was going to decide of whether or not they should legalize marijuana. And of course, everyone in Washington was going to vote yes, legalize it. But everyone who was working in the industry was trying to press, like, we should not legalize this. Like, weed should not be legalized, because once that happens, then it's going to become monopolized, and all of the small farmers are going to lose their farms that they've had for like
Mm.
50 years, multiple decade long farms. And like, it's just going to turn into Walmart weed with the like crazy strong, crazy toxic from pesticides. And I mean, it was just funny to see like the internal workings of the politics of drug legalization. And now I'm very against weed, like in general today. But the general public just assumes that like nothing will go wrong when you legalize weed. And now, a decade in, thousands of people are being admitted to the ER for psychotic breaks and schizophrenia
Mm.
induced by this like monster marijuana that's produced in these mega farms. So look where it's leading us. Super
Well,
weird.
it's also very useful, again, for the ruling class to anesthetize people, or
Yeah.
to render them incapable of critical thought, which is why I think, in terms of in organizational terms, you got to insist to people, if you want to be an active communist, then you've got to be essentially get your mind together and get off this stuff, really, because you can't be engaging with or trying to build a party organization amongst the wider working class if you're off your head, because you're just not capable, and the drug will render you incapable of doing anything productive. I understand why
Yeah.
people get stuck on it. I understand why people like take it, because like if you're looking for some kind of way to like literally numb yourself to like the frustrations of this society that we live in, and it is an appealing prospect. But now the state is quite literally pushing it at you. You should be very wary of that. Take a step back, because the things they push on you, whether it's bad food, bad booze, or bad drugs, none of these things are good for you. And you have to wake up to the point that like the ruling class do literally do not care if they poison the working class because, there's plenty more where they came from. We
Yeah.
are all utterly disposable to them, always have been. And like, no matter what they say now about, we've learned from the horrors of our past. No, the system dictates that the ruling class will always see the proletariat essentially as a disposable tool, and therefore it doesn't matter like what shit they feed you, what they push on you, what garbage culture they immerse you in, because there's plenty more where you came from, and that's their attitude. And until you realize that, then it's get over this idea that they have there is any value on human life to them whatsoever, and get over this the what I would call the sort of the human rights propaganda model that's pushed on us, with the idea that these nations that we live in are ruled by people who care about individual rights whatsoever. They want you to believe that you do because that's the propaganda. But in reality, just as always, it's a bourgeois dictatorship, and the only right that matters is bourgeois right, not ours.
Yeah, we're cattle. We're cattle to them. They view us like cattle. And oh my god, I don't know if you saw on Twitter. Fucking Twitter. When the student protests for Palestine were happening on the university campuses, there was a huge discourse on Twitter for like a week about whether or not people should be doing drugs and having sex with people in tents at the protests. Like that was like a huge discourse for like 1 or 2 weeks.
I do remember
That
that.
was
I think
yeah.
just, I mean, if that's what you're going there to do, A, that's pretty fucking sad. And B, well, how do we think that the FBI, or in our case, MI5, operates in terms of getting stuff on people? Drugs, sex, booze, gambling in the past as well. Like if you're out there doing that, you've already compromised yourself, likely in 100 different ways. It just goes to show people who think that it's all about that, they are tourists. They are unserious people, and you have to be absolutely clear about that. Like if you have to conduct yourself in a disciplined fashion if you're going to go around and apparently try and act as a communist in these movements. You got to be much more serious than the left has been over the last 50 to 60 years. Because what you just said, let's go to this place, get high, and like you know engage in some kind of sexcapade. Well, that's been their attitude now for decades, and all it's led to is everybody having a giant FBI or MI5 file filled with your weaknesses and your vices that can be deployed strategically later. So it's a very
Mhm.
unserious mindset, and people have again this is all the stuff that's got to be left behind. That and claiming that going out and going to the gym and exercising is somehow fascist.
Oh
um,
my god. I can't believe that. People think that. That's insane. Holy shit.
Well, I literally had this argument a while ago. It was like because like, and it all comes back to the fact that like fascists are all obsessed with like the whole aesthetics of like muscular men and all that kind of stuff. But as a comrade pointed out, like they actually the fascist aesthetic, and the fascist like promotion of like the square jawed individual, that kind of thing, was a bastardization of ideals that were ripped off from communism. Like
Yeah.
communism promoted the new Soviet man, promoted the new Soviet woman together as equal partners in actually building socialism. Of course, fascism being essentially a bourgeois rip-off act of certain aesthetic aspects of the communist movement of the time in order to tap into the mass appeal those aesthetics did have and then bastardizing them, like they polluted all of that. But remember that the reason why the bourgeois ripped off those aesthetics is because those are strong and positive, or they were, point towards a better, healthier future for
Hmm.
proletarians, which is what we were meant to aspire to. To allow that to be polluted by like the obsessions of Hitler and Mussolini, who were deliberately ripping it off, is foolish. And to elevate the idea that the ideal Marxist is some fat, porn obsessed, drug addled shut in who never goes outside and spends all his time posting. Like when that became the ideal, like that should have been the moment when people started asking questions.
Well, I've also been thinking a lot lately about uh, at least 21st century war on beauty and this an intentional promotion. It seems to be an intentional promotion of just ugliness is happening. I don't know what's going on, especially in the fashion world. Fashion today is so ugly in like a demoralizing and demeaning and devaluing way.
Hmm.
And I feel like leftists really promote this idea that, I mean, classical beauty, like the Soviets were really promoting that. They were really promoting that in their artwork, in the Soviet realism. It was all really beautiful, like classical style
Hmm.
paintings, but with a new twist. And to combat that, we had the Congress for Cultural Freedom promoting the modernist art and postmodernist art that really just scrambles everything up.
Hmm.
I'm really seeing that today in the fashion world in particular, which is really interesting. And also in cartoons, like even kids' cartoons have gotten super hideous. I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but I grew up watching like Disney's Fantasia, the original one, that is super, just absolutely amazing. The Soviets had an amazing hand drawn animation. Cartoons used to be really beautiful, and today kids' cartoons are like hideous. I don't know. Have you noticed this?
Um, I haven't because I don't watch a lot of that, but I've seen some explanations of this, which might relate also partly to like the a general degeneration in sort of standards coming from monopolization. So like I know that they outsource a lot of the animation to the cheapest studios they can possibly find, get it done as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But the other side of it, which you were talking about, the embrace of ugliness, is to my mind the root of that comes from the fact that imperialism in US and British terms is a decaying culture in the fact that it can't produce anything positive anymore. It can only extract vampire like from around the world. It can't produce anything decent in terms of culture anymore. It can only and it can't produce a vision of the future that is positive for anybody. So what it wants to produce in culture, I think, is demoralization and an acceptance that things are only going to get worse and uglier, and so therefore a promotion of like the worst sort of degenerate aspects in culture makes
Mm-hmm.
sense, because what the two things you want to encourage people to do is a accept the fact that you are an atomized and lonely individual or collection of individuals who are not part of anything wider, for whom there is no future, there is no hope. So what they want to do is to push people from the earliest possible age into embracing hopelessness and embracing of like vices as the only freedom you can have. The as like and also it sort of embracing crudity and embracing like violence and savagery and self-centeredness and all of those things that all of those aspects of like the culture in the Western European and American states, of these imperialist states, that is symptomatic. They want you to get used to it and they want you to embrace it as good. And I think that that lies at the root of a lot of things. And the fact that that all the aesthetics are so terrible, partly comes through like cheap production, but also because at root, the people who design a lot of this stuff don't believe in anything positive because there's nothing positive for them to actually see. And so it's all just based on, hey, everything's like falling apart and looks ugly and disgusting. So let's embrace that and call it good, which is like why a lot of the middle class left just embrace all the hideousness and call it good, because there's no
Yeah.
positive vision of the future. And there's no positive vision of the future because for the left, there's no concept anymore that we have a future to build where the working class becomes the ruling class. That's gone in the left. That went many decades ago. But if you do believe that the American and British proletariat can free us from the legacies of imperialism and actually build something anew, then you start to develop, in my view, aesthetic choices based on that positive future. You start to see um, possibilities open up again, and therefore that leads to wanting to have stronger aesthetics and more, um, shall we say, inspirational aesthetics to actually convey that message to people in an appealing fashion. If your point of view is let's sit here and rot away in decay and get high, then you don't need strong aesthetics to do that. You just need to embrace all the
Yeah.
ugliness and filth around you.
Yeah, it's like it's a total embrace, and I think an intentional push of laziness. And in the fashion world, you're right. It's probably like they're just fucking lazy. I think a lot of these designs are also being created by AI at this point too. Like sometimes I see stuff
Hmm.
and I'm like, this outfit is literally just this whole collection from this brand has to be done by AI. That's the only way that they're able to pump out this much garbage. But people are totally embracing it, and it's really interesting to see. Cause I mean, I am really fascinated by Gen Z and their embrace of this, like it looking like you got dressed in the dark, and that's in vogue. That's
Hmm.
the cool way to be. Anyway, enough of that. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you about before I let you go is identity politics. And this is something we talk about on my podcast all the time. And I feel like we can never talk about it enough because it is such a huge issue within communist organizing. And the party that you're a member of, the Communist Party Great Britain, ML, a few years ago put out an amazing pamphlet specifically about identity politics and the reactionary forces behind it. I kind of just wanted to get your analysis of identity politics in its current form and how that's going so far.
Well, I think it stems from its origins go back to what we were discussing earlier, which is it's an embrace of the idea that there is no collective liberation anymore because the left gives up on the working class as the revolutionary agent. Herbert Marcuse and the New Left became increasingly open about that from in the mid '60s onwards. So if you've displaced the working class as the future ruling class, and that you've declared that the working class is hopelessly corrupted and can't lead the revolution anymore, then well, who is your revolutionary agent? And in the case of like certain aspects of the American and British left, it's either racial minorities to a degree, or those who are excluded from society, be that by sexuality or so called gender identity or whatever other category you want to put in there. Once you've decided that it's the excluded who are the revolutionary subject, and yet capitalism keeps changing so that the people who had been previously excluded en masse then are then somewhat embraced by the system in that a bourgeois of that group can join the wider ruling class, which is what happened in a lot of those struggles in the 1960s. Once that's
Mm-hmm.
happened, then you're looking for narrower and narrower groups who you can claim are still excluded to become the revolutionary subject, and that's why they end up on gender ideology. Because all the way through the 90s and 2000s in America and Britain, we got to the point where the 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 changes in bourgeois law reached the point where you could now be openly gay and lesbian and be a member of the ruling class and actually be celebrated for it if you were a member of the ruling class. The only thing that really matters is your capital, after all. Um, so that struggles out because there's if you're a left middle class leftist looking for grant money in the NGO world, no money in that anymore. So we've got to find another cause. So there's gender ideology, or there's sex positivity, so called, or there's prostitution legalization. All of which, by the way, has come up at various union conferences I've been at over the last decade, and has been endorsed by all of them. Because again, like this is the constant quest for a new revolutionary subject, which isn't the proletariat as a whole, and that's incentivized by loads of many structures in Western societies, NGOs principally amongst them. Ruling class encourages all of this stuff, And so when you end up with gender ideology as the big cause célèbre, it's because they've decided they've alighted upon this because the men who and it is mostly men involved in this who suddenly decide that they're women now. They're like the apparently the most excluded subject of all. That's what the claim is from these people. And if you've decided that, then you're going to hysterically defend it because your entire understanding of the world is that these are the most oppressed people over here. This is where the revolution is being fought. I've actually had people scream this at me, um, and but it all comes down to the fact that they abandoned the idea of the working class as the new ruling class, as the class that is going to overcome class divisions, and just embrace this ever shifting identitarian stew that every time that they fought an ideal subject of oppression, the ruling class then elevated some of them. And then the ruling class duly elevated some of the gender ideologues and the trans warriors, so to speak. So even that's like now run into a dead end. But the identity politics is promoted relentlessly by the ruling class because it's also a fundamentally individualistic worldview. It's a fundamentally individualistic worldview because it basically boils down struggles to matters of like individual rights and individual claims upon rights, and
Hmm.
they need to construct new legal regimes within the existing state and within the existing bourgeois state. So another group can get another set of rights attached to it. It's fragmentary, it's atomizing. And again,
Yep.
the ruling class is really happy with this, really happy with this. And also the idea that, you know, that this group is like the trans group is now the most excluded and the most oppressed when the certain of their representatives are being given like TV shows on like by the BBC is like it's ridiculous. Like it's a fundamentally irrational mode of analysis because it's not doing any analysis. Um, and the obsession with it again goes back to the fact that first of all, this is an acceptable mode of struggle that is allowed to you by the ruling class. And for many people on the left, because they're involved in the NGO world, they're involved in academia or the bureaucracy of the trade union movement, that kind of struggle is great because you never take on the power of the employers, you never take on the power of the state. In fact,
Hmm.
bits of the state are backing you up. And you can have a nice career for yourself battling oppression purely online, calling yourself, like, I don't know, a gender warrior Maoist from the 25th century or something. Um, and you can be, and again, you can keep the grant money coming in, you can keep your job as an academic. You can never feel like the dead hand of the state on your shoulder, as people do who actually do engage in real struggles, such as um, bitter labor disputes or the struggle against real struggles against British and US imperialism via the struggle against the Israeli perpetrated genocide. People involved in that movement get arrested, beaten up, they lose their jobs. The middle class left doesn't really want to get involved in any of that. They want to
No.
have a fight against a phantom version of what they call fascism that doesn't really exist. They want to battle that
Hmm.
online all day because that there lies security whilst looking like a radical, which is what like a tendency of the left has always chased after. I mean, Marx was criticizing these people in the 1840s, armchair radicals, etc. The thing is, for us, the problem is that after so many years of defeats and disaster, the armchair radicals was all that was left. And so, therefore, for those of us who want to recreate things, we have to start by critically analyzing the so called Marxism of the armchair radicals or the online radicals and picking it to pieces, demonstrating why it's anti Marxist, why it's anti materialist, why it's anti worker, why it can't lead anywhere, and why it's not supposed to lead anywhere. And I think the documents produced by my party during the controversy with the ID poll people a few years ago have actually it turns out to be quite valuable in guiding other comrades through this similar struggle. But again,
Hmm.
we start our rebuilding process by criticizing what is the edifice, the wretched edifice that Western leftism is, in order that people understand and we what it is and what we are, and paraphrase Mao, we draw clear dividing lines between ourselves and the enemy. Everybody says combat liberalism. Nobody reads the essay it's attached to, because what it's actually about is investigating the bourgeois ideology that is there within us. It's nobody. This isn't a matter of casting blame. This is just what we grow up with. We grow up from the earliest possible point in our lives, when our parents turn the radio on or turn the TV on, or you have an iPad thrust in front of you as a small child. You're absorbing bourgeois ideology,
Hmm.
and like the consciousness is a funny thing. You don't know how much of it is in there until you start pushing in later on and thinking, well, why do I think that? Why is that my response? And you find that at the root of it is the fact that the bourgeoisie employs some very, very sophisticated and very well funded propaganda efforts, and that bourgeois propaganda goes all the way through the culture. It's just not just the TV news, it's not just the politicians, it's in every single aspect of everything we live and breathe around us. That's the nature of the bourgeois dictatorship. And like the things that the left is allowed to shout and scream about the loudest are all part of that. It's all part of catching people who could become actual proletarian fighters and sending them down a dead end, be it Trotskyism, be it
Yeah.
identity politics, be it all kinds of other things that you can get involved in that just lead you absolutely nowhere except to, if you're sincere, demoralization. And if you're not sincere, a career being a talking head on MSNBC if you're lucky.
Yeah, they really play up the atomization of the self and the individual and individual rights and individual liberties is to distract from class politics. Class consciousness has been super successful, and I don't understand how people don't see this at this point. And I have people telling me that trans is dialectical, and that according to Marx and Engels, it's scientific and it's the future. And I mean, that to me is just I am so perplexed of how the belief science people, looking at the science that we have now, are going to stand behind what they're doing. And I mean, that's a whole other, I could talk about that for probably 6 hours. Um, but how did the left in England deal with the whole Tavistock Institute scandal and the cast review? How did that go down? From, because you're on the inside, I was watching it unfold from like the
Mm.
outside perspective. How was that as an inside view?
That's quite easy. They didn't deal with it. Those that did just said, "Oh, it's Tory-sponsored transphobia," and those who pushed the trans thing, like my friends in Navarra Media, who've all blocked me now on Twitter, which is funny, or the likes of Owen Jones, just either ignored it, pretended it didn't happen, which is the way they always don't deal with things. If they get caught out, they pretend it didn't happen. And just on I mean, you research into the Tavistock Clinic, go
Oh
back
yeah.
70, 80 years, you find out that they've been involved in personality deconstruction and reconstruction since before, since like the 40s, hypnosis,
Yeah, even
personality
earlier,
changes, that
since
kind of
World War
thing.
One.
Yeah.
World War One was when they started out as a social engineering institute.
So this has been their game for a century, for over a century. And so we're supposed to embrace this now as liberation. This is ridiculous. This is the same stuff that they've been running for years, which is this is the same stuff that both the American and British ruling classes have been obsessed with, which is how do we destroy people's personalities, basically? How do we destroy psyches and rebuild them in an image that we like? This is this is like MK Ultra stuff, basically. How do we take, and
Yeah.
this is the stuff that they were doing, the American government was doing in the prison system in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and probably to this day, which is how do we break down people and reprogram them? That's like been a long term project, going all the way back to. I mean, that's what the fiction of the Manchurian Candidate was really all about. Because in actual fact, it was the American government doing the brainwashing of soldiers who'd actually discovered the real crimes that were being committed in the Korean War. But they've been so interested in reprogramming people and carrying out experiments on people's mental health patients, on people who've been locked away and can't give consent anymore to medical procedures. They've been interested in manipulating vulnerable and mentally ill people for over a century. And that's what this
Yeah.
is, really, when it comes down to it.
Hmm.
This is the same thing, but just with a different label on it, which is,
It's the
well,
new
how do we,
lobotomy.
yeah, how do we take, how, I mean, they did experiments in the 60s, and this is like confirmed by like bourgeois writers now on like violent criminals. They would experiment on them and they say, oh, it's about taking out the violent aspect of the personality. Lie. It was actually about enhancing the violent aspect of the personality. And like this was all part of like the psychological conditioning experiments. Again, you read the Cass review. This seems to me to be the same business that Tavistock's been in for, as you said, a century. And like, and but then again, we perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that the left embraced it. There used to be leftists who embraced eugenics, who embraced so-called
Oh yeah.
scientific racism. I mean, H.G.
Oh yeah.
Wells, George Bernard Shaw, the Fabian Society, people like that, who were
Margaret
um,
Sanger.
yeah, the eugenicists, Malthusianism, all of which has been part of like various aspects of the left for a long time. So, if you put it in that context, perhaps this isn't a surprise. What's
Uh,
changed is the fact that back then there was communism in a real way present in these countries, in the form of the original CPUSA, the original CPGB in our case. And what's changed is that the communists got destroyed and then subverted, and became part of this. And again, this is one of the reasons why the ruling class is so invested in stopping the development of actual communist parties, because once enough workers learn how to apply dialectical materialism themselves, or as being guided by the party education program, then they'll see through things like this really quickly. And that's also why the academics have always been, have been for a long time, anti-Marxist, Leninist, and anti-communist, because it puts them out of a job. Because most of them are just paid to lie to the working class and to delude the middle class.
I mean, Judith Butler's not a Marxist.
Apparently, she's going to lead the American Revolution. Haven't you heard?
Oh my god. Oh my god. Yeah, well, brilliant. I'm that pamphlet that we both were talking about from CPGBML, I'm going to link that in the show notes as well so people can go ahead and read it because it is really well written. It's very easily read as well. But other than that, how else can my listeners find your work?
Yeah, just search for Marx Engels Lenin Institute on YouTube or X, and you can find me on there fairly easily. Or if you're on Telegram, search for the same thing, Marx Engels Lenin Institute. There's a very active Telegram community there where all kinds of things are debated, and those who come in with bourgeois propaganda are swiftly destroyed. Um, so. Um, that's how the best way to find me. Or if you want to like email me, just it's just editor at marxengelsinstitute.org. That's often the best way to pose a direct question. But yeah, those are the principal ways you can find me.
Awesome. I'm going to link all of that below as well so people can just click on it and follow you and support your work. Do you have a Patreon too? I'll link that.
Yes, it's just
Okay.
it's in the show blurb. I'll send you the link.
Okay, perfect. Well, this has been a great chat, Alex. I'm super glad to have you here, and you're welcome back literally anytime to talk about anything you ever would like. And I hope our listeners enjoyed this as well.
Well, I extend the invitation back to you as well. If you ever want to come on and give the British end of the British end of things, the American view, you can be the designated representative of the future American communist state.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you next time.